Hello, Science 30. This lesson is going to be on cardiovascular disease, heart disorders, and some other disorders associated with blood vessels. I'm going to talk about several different things that can increase the likelihood that someone would go on to develop cardiovascular disease, and that primarily does include heart attack and stroke, that we'll talk about a little bit later. On this slide here, what I do have is the relationship between diet, what you take in through your diet, and cardiovascular disease. So many different things that you take in through your diet, water, vitamins, minerals, carbohydrates, proteins, but here I'm going to kind of focus on the fat that you do take in through your diet. So fat in your diet, very important for a number of different things. Fat is very high in calories to allow you to use that for energy. And it's also a vital component of the cell membrane. The phospholipid bilayer is made up mostly of fat. What you also take in through your diet is cholesterol, and cholesterol, again, is one component of your cell membrane embedded in the phospholipid bilayer. So both of these, in fact, are very important dietary components that are necessary and required by your body. Cholesterol is transported in your blood in two different forms. And those two different forms are what are referred to as high density lipoproteins, or HDLs, and the other one, they are low density lipoproteins, or the LDLs. So both of these, they are certainly influenced by your liver. They're produced in your liver. You don't necessarily take these in through your diet, but from what you do take in through your diet, it has an influence on the HDLs and the LDLs that your liver is going to be producing. So the LDLs are generally considered to be the good cholesterol, and what that means in terms of cardiovascular disease is they prevent you from having a heart attack or a stroke, or make it less likely that you will have a heart attack or a stroke. The other ones, the HDLs, well, they're exactly the opposite. They would increase your likelihood of having a heart attack or a stroke. So if your doctor sends you to get a blood test done, they may check off a couple of the boxes for your total cholesterol, and also taking a look at the ratio between the HDLs and the LDLs, and generally you want to have the higher proportion of the HDLs, and a lower proportion of the LDLs. I mentioned that this is influenced greatly by your liver, and that in turn is impacted by genetics, and it's also impacted by your diet. So your diet and genetics sort of tell your liver what to do in terms of the HDLs and LDLs that are spit out by the liver and end up going into the blood. So a diet that is high in, we're going to talk about some different kinds of fats. Saturated fats. Saturated fats are naturally occurring, and also hydrogenated or trans fats that are not naturally occurring. These are human created or generated fats, and both of these, the saturated and the hydrogenated or trans fats, they increase the LDLs, which is your bad cholesterol, and they decrease your good cholesterol. So consuming these in your diet would make it more likely that you would have more of the LDLs, which is the bad cholesterol, and making it more likely that you might eventually end up with cardiovascular disease, predisposing you to having a heart attack or a stroke. So exercise and diet are both really, really important. Exercise and diet with a higher proportion of, in your diet, unsaturated fats as opposed to the saturated. And we'll take a look at where you can get these from, but what are called omega-3s, especially from fatty fish, from flax, and from various different kinds of nuts. They will lower your bad cholesterol and possibly even raise your good cholesterol, and that is certainly the case with the exercise in terms of increasing your good cholesterol. The HDL is one of the many, many reasons why exercise is so incredibly important. So I broke in the next 3 slides down here into the different kinds of fats. So I call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the good ones are the unsaturated fats. So these are typically the plant source fats for the most part. So if we think about oils that you might use in the kitchen, so corn oil, canola oil, those would be plant-based oils. Other ones like avocados, avocado oil, various different kinds of nuts, nut oil, especially the walnuts that we see here, the almonds that we see here, olive oil, all of those are unsaturated fats and generally considered to be the good ones. And what seems to be especially good are the fats that you get from fatty fish. So that includes the salmon that we see here, that includes tuna, and they especially contain those omega-3s that I mentioned. And these ones seem to be particularly good in terms of protecting someone against cardiovascular disease. So yes, important that you do have fish in your diet, probably a couple of times a week. So what about the bad? So these ones here are the naturally occurring saturated fats. So yes, I'm calling these ones the bad. So these come from more animal sources. So in the picture that we see here, of course, the beef that we see with the fat around the outside, and this is saturated fat. Generally think these are solid at room temperature, whereas the unsaturated fats, they are liquid at room temperature. Other animal sources as well, so pork and chicken would also be saturated fats, and the fats that you get from animals, including things like butter. So this picture down here just kind of gives an indication in terms of the chemistry of the difference between a saturated and an unsaturated fat. So if we look at this long chain of carbons in this fatty acid here, it's completely filled up with hydrogen, and when it's completely filled up, the word that we use is saturated. In the case of unsaturated, these carbons here, we could have an extra hydrogen on them, but we don't. Those have been removed, and we have a double bond in between, and that's what's making this unsaturated fat, is that simple change to this fatty acid in this carbon chain, hydrocarbon chain that we do see here. So those ones, yes, you should, or they say they should try and minimize the amount of these fats that you do take in through your diet. And for sure, these ones here as well. So these are the ones that are not naturally occurring. These are the ones that what we have done, humans have done, is we've taken fats that are not so bad, like corn oil, which is an unsaturated fat, and we add hydrogen. We hydrogenate it. And what that does is it turns an unsaturated fat into a saturated fat. And as it turns out, it also creates these ones here, which are called the trans fats. And this is a picture of the chemical structure of a trans fat here. So these ones here, they discovered, are particularly harmful in terms of your cardiovascular health. So processed foods in the past anyway have been a major source in our diet of these trans fats. But thankfully in Canada over the last few years, there has been a ban on these trans fats, and food companies have been slowly transitioning over to other, hopefully healthier fats. And again, most of these is what you would find in the processed foods like we see in the picture here. So the Canada Food Guide as of 2019, this is just a picture that really simplifies it. But on the plate that we see here, 50%, half of the plate, half of the food that you are taking in should be coming from, well, primarily vegetables, but fruits as well. The other 25% or a quarter from the kind of carbohydrate source. But if you look closely at the picture, you'll see that these are whole grains. So it is whole wheat pasta. It is brown rather than the white rice. It is whole grain and brown bread, wheat, rather than the white. Fluids, drinking water as your beverage of choice as opposed to the fruit juices. And for the last quarter, the protein, where to get your protein from. So in the past, it has been the meat and the dairy products, but you'll notice in the picture here, now there are a bunch of other things, the vegetables. So we have the legumes, the beans, we have the nuts, there's some lentils over here, chickpeas, some kidney beans. There are some dairy products. It looks like we have some yogurt in here. A little bit of the beef, lean beef, lean chicken, fat-free or as little fat as possible, and the fish that we saw before, the salmon. So this is the current Canada Food Guide and the recommendations that they do have for us. And a lot of this, again, does have to do with cardiovascular health. So back to the risk factors. So the one that was already mentioned, of course, is diet. So we'll jot that one down. So what about the diet? Well, it is what's going to contribute to, anyway, your chance of having a heart attack or a stroke is the saturated fats. Okay, so that would increase your chance of having a heart attack or a stroke. There are some other things as well. So too much food in your diet can lead to obesity. So being overweight, being obese, can also increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. Also related to the diet, salt in the diet, and a contributing factor to things like high blood pressure. High blood pressure, high BP, is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So a number of these are linked together as well. Exercise, we mentioned exercise, but it's really the lack of exercise, whether it's cardiovascular or whether it is resistance training. It's the lack of exercise that's going to increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. Other things that you're probably aware of as well, so stress, it kind of ties in with the high blood pressure as well. And of course, diet and obesity, that sort of ties in with lack of exercise, that leads to obesity. So again, many of these are linked together in one way or the other. You probably already know smoking is also a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. We haven't talked about it yet, but platelets are one of the components in your blood. They're responsible for sealing up blood vessels, and smoking has an influence on those. Other ones as well that you don't necessarily have a lot of control over: age. So the fact of the matter is, the older you are, the more damage that has taken place to your blood vessels and the increased likelihood of having a heart attack or a stroke. Genetics, you have no control over, of course, your genetics. Some people are just simply more predisposed to cardiovascular disease than others are. Sex, and here I'm talking about biological sex, males in particular, are more likely to have a heart attack or a stroke. And again, that'll be tied into a whole bunch of other things. Males are also probably more likely, well, they have that genetic predisposition simply because they are a male, probably more likely to be smokers, more likely overall to have more stress, less exercise, be obese, and consume more things in their diet, like the saturated fats and the salt. Of course, that's not the case with all males, but as a general rule, comparing males to females, that is typically what we do see. Just a couple of other ones that I'll jot down here as well. Viruses, exposure to certain viruses may increase the incident or likelihood of someone having a heart attack or a stroke as well. So that's a pretty good list that we have of a whole bunch of things that would make it more likely that someone might have a heart attack or a stroke. So let's take a look at a few animations here. These animations do have some audio, but I have turned it off because it doesn't turn up very good with these recordings. So the first one that we'll take a look at here, what they're going to talk about is these are a bunch of things that you do have in your blood. LDLs, HDLs, we already saw. Red blood cells for transporting oxygen. Monocytes are one kind of white blood cell for fighting off infections, and platelets for sealing off blood vessels. So at the start of this animation, really all they're talking about in here is that we do have these various different things that are circulating around in our blood vessels. This is showing an artery in this picture, and arteries do have several different layers along the lining of the blood vessels. And what it's showing here is that as the blood is flowing through, something is happening in between the layers. And what that is the bad cholesterol is getting in and accumulating. It's not sticking to the inside of blood vessels. It's actually getting between the layers. It's getting underneath what is called the endothelial layer. And then the white blood cells, they try and get in there and clean things up. But eventually they're kind of overwhelmed. The key with this picture, though, that hopefully you notice, is that the diameter of this blood vessel, it's becoming narrower and narrower. So what that means is if the blood vessel is narrower, then there's less blood flow that's reaching whatever tissues are further on down the line. As we do have this buildup inside of the blood vessels as well, it also makes them more rigid. That's going to increase the blood pressure, and that's going to make it more likely that blood vessels are going to be damaged even more, and we would see more of this accumulation, this hardening of the arteries, which is called atherosclerosis, the buildup between the layers. We should see, or would see, more of that as time goes on. So hopefully that, of course, would not be the case, but that is typically what is seen, and as someone does age, this next simple animation here is just going to kind of walk us through, starting at the left-hand side, what would be nice, and at the far right-hand side, what we don't want. So ideally, inside of the blood vessel, nice and smooth. We have no buildup in between the lining of the various different layers of the blood vessel. Blood can flow through nice and smoothly. There's no resistance. The blood vessel is pliable. It can stretch out. It's not rigid. But as time goes on, through diet, lack of exercise, genetics, things do start to change. So here we start to see just in between the layers what they're calling these fatty streaks. And over time, it just kind of builds up. Eventually, as we saw, white blood cells kind of get in there to clean up the mess. Things do start to harden over time. So at this point here, we have this calcification, we have atherosclerosis, we have hardening of the arteries, and now the blood pressure is going to go up. So as the blood pressure starts to go up as well, it can damage the blood vessels even more. And eventually, we might get to the point where that high blood pressure is kind of chipping away at the inner lining of the blood vessel, and we can get a rupture of that particular area where we do have this plaque buildup. So when that happens, platelets are going to come into the area. They're going to try and seal off that damage. They're going to try and fix it. But if we already have the narrowing of the blood vessel and platelets coming in and trying to seal it up, they do stick together, and that might lead to, well, a complete blockage in that blood vessel. So this term that we see up above here, myocardial infarction, myocardial is referring to the heart muscle itself, and it's talking about the blockage of the blood supply going to a region of the heart, and myocardial infarction is the death of the heart tissue. So if enough of the heart tissue has its supply blood blocked off, then that heart attack that it would lead to can end up killing the person as well. So of course it can end up being lethal depending upon the degree of the myocardial infarction. So very, very serious, and again, it's sort of cumulative over time, and the longer you live, and again, depending upon your lifestyle and genetics and various other things, then of course you don't want this to happen. And to some extent, by changing your diet, by changing your lifestyle, exercising more, some of this might be to some extent reversible. So that's kind of the good news as well. So I'm not going to play these ones for you, but the one on the left is showing a heart attack, and the one on the right a stroke, or at least what can lead to that. So in terms of the heart, what we're talking about is a blockage in the coronary arteries. So what we see on the surface of this heart here, these red and blue lines, those are the coronary blood vessels. And the red ones are the ones that are delivering the oxygenated blood and the nutrients to the heart muscle itself. It needs its own blood supply. So if we have a blockage here, that means that blood is not reaching further on down the line. And if blood doesn't reach tissue that needs oxygen and nutrients, then that tissue is eventually going to die. So in this larger circle here, what we see is that, yes, it's being pinched off. What we have is this buildup of this fatty tissue between the layers. We have the narrowing of the blood vessel, so not as much blood can be flowing through. So an early indication is when the person does start to exert themselves, they start to exercise, or maybe even just walking, they start to feel chest pain, which is called angina. And that's a pretty good indication that you should probably go and see your doctor and get things checked out. So heart attack is a lack or decreased blood flow to the heart muscle. Stroke is talking specifically about the brain. Same sort of thing, only now it's in the blood vessels that are delivering oxygen to the brain. So if you cut off this blood supply to a portion or all of the brain, that of course can end up being lethal as well. And if it's not lethal, it can lead to permanent, very debilitating conditions related to paralysis and numbness and loss of any functions, depending upon what portion of the brain is actually impacted by that decreased blood flow or the complete blockage in the blood flow. So this next line here, again, I'm not going to go over all of these, but these are some treatments. And in this case here, this is specifically for the heart, not for the brain. So dealing with if there is a blockage in one of the coronary arteries, first of all, how do you diagnose it? And then secondly, what can you actually do about it? So in terms of the diagnosis, if someone does have the chest pain, they go to the doctor, they may send them for what is called an angiogram. And what we'll see is that this is going to give an actual picture of the coronary arteries to show if there is a blockage. If they determine that there's a blockage, there's various different things that can be done, some more invasive than others. So angioplasty, atherectomy, and what's called a coronary bypass surgery. Let's take a look at this one here for the angiogram. So again, this would be if someone goes to the doctor, they're experiencing chest pain, the doctor would send them for an angiogram, and they're kind of saying, let's get a picture of the blood vessels and see if there's a blockage. Blood vessels don't show up on x-rays, so what they need to do is get something into the body in order to make the blood vessels visible. So here we are zooming in on one of the coronary arteries, and what they're showing us is that there is going to be, well, a partial blockage. So we can see in yellow here, this is the buildup, and this is what would lead to increased blood pressure, decreased blood flow to portions of the heart that are down the line from where this blockage is. So it may be one blockage or it may be multiple blockages, and that's the idea behind the angiogram, is they want to find out exactly where those blockages are. So this is an invasive procedure, which means they're sticking something into the body. So if we take a look at this picture here now, what they're sticking in is called a guide wire going through the femoral artery or the brachial artery now in the arm, and it's going up into what's called the descending aorta, now looking at the larger picture, up through the aorta and in the area of the coronary blood vessels. Then they're going to inject the dye. This is a contrast medium that will show up on x-ray. So all of this is real time. The patient, the doctor, the technician, they can see it on the computer screen, and they can see right here that there is a narrowing of that blood vessel, and that's what the concern is. So now they're going to remove this guide wire out, and they're going to then decide what do they actually need to do in order to deal with this blockage. Otherwise, more than likely, it's going to get worse rather than better, and the person will end up having a heart attack, possibly. So they want to, of course, prevent that. So what can they do? So this one here we will take a look at. It is called an angioplasty or balloon angioplasty. Kind of starts off the same as the angiogram. So they are going to tap into, again, either the brachial artery, which is in the arm, kind of in the armpit area, or the femoral artery, which is in the groin area. And then they're going to feed in this guide wire again, which is fairly large. It's about a millimeter and a half in diameter. They're going to feed it up through the femoral or the brachial artery to the aorta and to where the actual blockage is. This time at the end of the guide wire, they're not going to be injecting a dye, but for starters, there is a balloon. So they will have a syringe at the other end of this wire outside of the body. And with that syringe, they're going to blow up the balloon. They're going to insert some air into this tube. They're going to inflate the balloon, as we will see here. And that's going to push outward on this narrowed blood vessel and open it up. But it's just going to snap shut over time. So they need to stick something in here as well that's going to hold it open. So it will still be more rigid, but at least they're going to be opening up the diameter of the blood vessel. So they're going to slide in some scaffolding. It's called a stent. So they're going to slide it in again using that same guide wire. And once they're at the correct location, it is just going to snap open inside of that blood vessel. And the idea behind this is it's going to keep that blood vessel open. Remove the guide wire, and this stent will then remain in that coronary artery, or it could be more than one coronary artery that it's necessary for them to do this on. The atherectomy, very similar, only now it's kind of like if you have a plug in your drain, your kitchen drain at home, and you call in the plumber, and they use an auger, and this time it's the auger that is at the end of this guide wire that's going to spin around and hopefully clean up and remove all of that plaque on the inside of the blood vessel. So these ones here, yes, they are invasive because they do involve sticking something into the body, but the person is conscious. Typically, they're awake at the time throughout the entire procedure, so they can, in fact, let the doctor know if anything feels wrong and isn't quite going correct for them. This one here, coronary bypass surgery. Again, coronary arteries that we're talking about, it is a surgery. It is open chest surgery. It is open heart surgery, and the heart does have to be stopped, possibly for a couple of hours, and circulated around the body using an external pump. So bypass is very similar to if there is a roadway. This is our roadway here. You're driving down the road, but there's an accident right here, or maybe there's some construction. So what can you do to get from point A to point B? Well, hopefully they have a detour. So that detour is a bypass, and it's essentially the same thing that they're doing with the coronary bypass surgery. So where does this other blood vessel come from? Well, they usually go into the person's leg, cut out what is referred to as a redundant blood vessel, and then they can use that, as it shows in the picture, to make a connection up above, down below where the blockage was. So again, they're just bypassing where that blockage was. So this one here, much, much more invasive, but it has been going on for decades and decades now, and they're very successful with these surgeries. And if they have multiple blockages, they could have a triple or a quadruple bypass surgery in order to sort of fix that problem that they're having with the blocked blood vessels. With the brain and the stroke, it's a completely different story. You just can't get in there and do those procedures in the brain, but there are some other strategies. So when your body does seal off an injured blood vessel, it is fibrin which is sealing it off. Fibrin is just a bunch of, think of it as thread, a thread-like network or like dental floss that's going to seal off a blood vessel. But eventually your body needs to clean up that clot. So this in fact is a clot, a natural clot, and your body produces what is called plasmin, which is eventually going to dissolve the clot after you fix the blood vessel. And in order to activate the plasmin, well, we need something abbreviated TPA, which stands for tissue plasminogen activator. So this is naturally produced by your body, and that's what's necessary to dissolve a clot. Well, what you do have with a stroke is kind of an unnatural clot, a clot that you don't want, but what they have done is this, which is naturally produced by your body, now they bottle it up, and it is a drug. So if someone is having a stroke, and if you get them to the hospital fairly quickly, like within a couple of hours, there are some risks associated with it, but if you are a potential candidate and if you had had a stroke, they can inject you with the TPA, it'll find that clot, and it'll dissolve that clot and restore that blood flow to that portion of the brain, possibly saving your life and certainly restoring any function that you might have lost as well. So just a couple of other blood vessel and valve disorders. An aneurysm is also dealing with the blood vessels, only now it's not a blockage, now it is a rupturing of the blood vessel. So if we take a look at this picture here, this is the normal blood vessel going across, but now it's kind of bulging out, and eventually then what can happen is it can in fact rupture if it does bulge out a little bit too much. So this is definitely a problem in the brain. And that's the sort of thing that could lead to a stroke and lead to death as well. Not too much to do in terms of a treatment for this one, where you can get in there and kind of fix that problem. This one here, aortic aneurysm, this is kind of an interesting one. Remember, the aorta is the largest artery in your body. It is under the greatest force, the highest pressure, and if this is to rupture, there's really nothing that can be done. The person has seconds before they essentially bleed out and end up dying very, very rapidly. So this picture here, it's showing the aortic arch that we've seen before coming out of the left ventricle, and then from there kind of branches. We have these branches going up to the arms, the right and the left arm, going up to the brain and the face area. Looping down is what's called the descending aorta. It goes around behind the heart, and then it goes to the kidneys, the renal arteries, and it goes down to the legs, your right and left leg, to the abdominal, to the pelvic region. But this region right here, the descending aorta, that's what I'm going to kind of talk about with this aortic aneurysm. So you definitely don't want this rupturing because it is pretty much instant death. And some people, it turns out, do have this bulging that we can see in this middle picture here. This bulging is in that descending aorta. So this is not normal. So what is really creating this, if we take a look at the pictures to the right, is blood is actually escaping out of the blood vessel and it's getting in between the layers. And that's what's causing those layers to weaken, and that's what's causing this bulging. So why might this happen? Well, different risk factors. Hypertension, which is high blood pressure, that can increase the incidence of this. Drugs, certain drugs like cocaine use, and genetic conditions like this one here, Marfan syndrome, can also increase the likelihood that this sort of thing might happen. What this graph is showing is it's essentially saying that once you get to the diameter of the aorta of about 5 to 6 centimeters, it's going to rupture. It's inevitable that that is going to happen. And if that does happen, it really is going to end up leading to death, if it is for sure 6 centimeters in diameter or more. So kind of nice if you can discover this ahead of time, because if it is discovered ahead of time, then something can be done. Unfortunately, it's not always discovered ahead of time. So sometimes there are people like this guy in the picture here that's doing all the right things, lifting weights, staying healthy, exercising, and unfortunately, the extremely high blood pressure that is created, especially when you're lifting the big weights like this guy is here, it can increase your blood pressure so dramatically that if someone does have a distended aorta, that's the kind of thing that can actually rupture that aorta and lead to death. Just one or two other slides here. So the septum, remember the dividing line between the two ventricles, that's called the septum. So ventricular septal defect, or simply referred to as a hole in the heart. So when you were a fetus, when everyone was a fetus, there is actually a hole that allows blood to go back and forth. Your lungs aren't functioning, of course, when you're a fetus. You're getting all of your oxygen coming from your mother and dumping carbon dioxide back into her blood. So blood doesn't actually need to go to your lungs. It doesn't go to your lungs. So you need this hole between the two ventricles to allow it to pass back and forth. But after someone is born, then this should seal off and there should no longer be a hole. As it turns out, there is about 10% of the population, about 1 in 10 people, do still have a hole between the ventricles. It's not really a hole like it shows here. It's more like a flap. And most of the time that flap is closed, and that flap is usually closed because the flap is on the left ventricular side, and because we have a higher pressure on this side than on the other side, well, it just pushes on that flap and keeps it closed anyway. So for the most part, it doesn't create any problem. This hole in the heart that remains in about 10% of the people, by the way, it's referred to as a patent foramen ovale, which is just the hole in the heart. Some heart valve defects. You do need to know a little bit about the heart valves, even though you don't need to know specific names of heart valves for Science 30. You do need to have a basic understanding that something can be wrong with the valves, and there are in fact some treatments for these as well, some valve replacements. So this is, they call this the aortic valve. This is actually the valve that's going out of the left ventricle and into the aorta. We know it as the left semilunar valve. It is one and the same thing. So when it opens, it should look like this. When it closes, it should look like this. It should be completely open when it opens. It should be completely closed when it closes. But we can have some defects where it doesn't quite open all the way, or it doesn't quite close all the way. So these are defects with the valves. And yes, in medicine, there is some potential to fix these with valve replacements. So various different mechanical synthetic valves that can be used. So this one has a couple of sort of flaps that just close when the valve should be closed. This one kind of spins, this wheel that spins. And this one, we have a stainless steel ball in this cage here. So blood can go in this direction. So this would be going from the atria, which would be down below in this case, according to this picture, to the ventricle, but blood cannot go in the opposite direction. So that's generally how these different valves would work, and again, that is the sort of thing that can be replaced if someone has a defect.